All right, so Dr. Ahlquist, take it away.
Thank you, Dr. McLarney. It's great to be with you all from Minneapolis, Minnesota, and my special greetings from planet Earth to Canada. I know that Canada is on a different planet. There's very few people that understand that, but I do, okay? So I'm going to give you just a relatively short talk this morning and then, or this afternoon, depends upon where we are. And I don't know what time zone planet Canada is in, but, and then I'm going to give you a chance to ask me questions. So please start thinking whatever you want to ask me about anything, but it can also be Chesterton related, all right? So one of the things that G.K. Chesterton says, and we're going to talk about Chesterton in connection to classical education. He says that the reason that we read the Iliad is because all of life is a battle. And the reason that we read the Odyssey is because all of life is a journey. And the reason that we read the book of Job is because all of life is a riddle. That's Chesterton's line. We could extend that same thinking to some of the other great classical works that we read at Chesterton Academy. We read Chaucer because all of life is a pilgrimage. We read Dante because all of life is about getting to heaven, even if we have to go through hell to get there, right? And we read Shakespeare because all the world's a stage. But why do we read Chesterton? Well, I guess we could say we read Chesterton because all of life is a paradox. And Chesterton is the master of paradox. And I'm going to talk about paradox for just a little bit, and then talk more about the other Chesterton books that we do read for Chesterton Academy. Paradox is explained throughout Chesterton's writings, and he's always full of paradox wherever he's writing. You can't open a page of Chester without encountering a paradox. And he defines it as a truth that consists of two truths that seem to contradict each other but are both true, or the truth that goes against our expectations, the truth that is a surprise. And that's really the literal meaning of the word paradox. It means something that is against received opinion or beside the received word. And it's a very Chestertonian concept that truth should be a surprise, because all of the best things are surprises. The best gifts are surprise gifts. And miracles are surprises. Everything that God has done in terms of creation is something that we really don't have any right to expect. And the proper response to the whole surprise of creation should be awe and wonder. But then this idea of the paradox, that's the contradiction between two things. Chesterton says that we see with two different eyes, right? We see two different pictures at once. If you close one eye, you're seeing a different picture than what you see with the other eye. And if you think about it, because you're seeing two different pictures, you're actually seeing a contradiction. But your normal mind will get past the contradiction of the two different images that you're taking into your head at one time. And Chesterton says our spiritual sight is just like our physical sight. It's stereoscopic. We see two things at once, but we see better because we see two things at once. And that's why we can believe that there's such a thing as fate, but also such a thing as free will. In other words, we can believe in God's omnipotent power, that he is in control of everything. But we also, in order to be sane, have to believe that we have free will. Because if God isn't totally in control, then he's not God and he's not worth worshiping. But if we don't have free will, well, then nothing matters at all. It doesn't matter what we do. We can't even say, please pass the salt if we don't have free will. And Chesterton makes a lot of use out of that device of paradox because it's the key to understanding everything. Truth naturally goes against our expectations, and there's this natural, apparently contradiction that is the essence of understanding. And Chesterton says we start with paradoxes right away in the nursery, in our fairy tales, that the Jack and the Beanstalk, or Jack the Giant Killer, is about the paradox of courage, that you have to be afraid in order to be brave, that courage means going closer to the thing you're afraid of in order to defeat it. It means stepping closer to death in order to live. And Cinderella's about the paradox of humility, that the humbled will be exalted. And Beauty and the Beast is about the paradox of love, because you have to love a thing first, and then you make it lovable afterwards. And then, of course, the Bible is full of paradox. The first shall be last, the last shall be first. You have to lay down your life in order to save it. Blessed are those who are poor. Blessed are those who mourn. The meek shall inherit the earth. That it's good to suffer for righteousness, and count it all joy when you meet various trials. And a virgin shall give birth, and the dead shall rise. Those are all completely contradictory ideas. We've come to accept them because we've heard them so many times, but that paradox is present there. And of course, the ultimate paradox is Jesus Christ, fully God, fully man. Those two things really completely go against each other. They contradict each other. You can't conceive of something that is both God and man at the same time, both divine and human at the same time. And yet we believe that that's exactly what Jesus is. And that's what reconciles all of humanity with God. It's time contradicting eternity, and it's life contradicting death. So that idea of paradox, you always find it in all of Chesterton, and it's fun to spot all the little paradoxes as you're reading Chesterton. The book where he really expounds on it beautifully is in his book Orthodoxy, which is the book you read either your freshman or junior or sophomore year. And Orthodoxy is how Chesterton himself came to Christianity. And it's one of the most unusual and refreshing defenses of Christianity that you've ever encounter, because Chesterton says he becomes a Christian not because of reading Christian literature, reading the great defenses of Christianity. He comes to be Christian because he reads all the attacks on Christianity, and he realizes that they are just not true, and that they don't seem to have any consistency, that Christianity is criticized for being too colorful, but also too austere, too big and too small, too heavenly and then too earthly. And all the things that people will attack the church for, they really end up defeating their own arguments by making the counter arguments. Chesterton says if a thing is called too tall and too short and too red and too green and too large and too small, you could probably be assured that it's just the right thing. And in Orthodoxy, he has this wonderful chapter called The Ethics of Elfland, where he talks about the truths that he learns in the nursery. And he also talks about what a scientific law is. And the reason that we read Orthodoxy is because it helps us better understand a scientific understanding of the world in its proper understanding. Because as Chesterton says, a scientific law is only a weird repetition that we can't explain. when we say that something's a scientific law, all we are saying is that we've observed this thing to happen over and over again. However, it sometimes doesn't happen, and that's a miracle. I mean, gravity works most of the time. That's the way you bet. But there are saints who levitate. There are saints who fly, who break the law of gravity. He says a law is something that can be broken. A law is something that can be broken. When man makes a law, people break the laws. When God makes a law, people break the laws. There's an element of choice in it. And even God is allowed to break the natural laws that he's created, which is what a miracle is. All right, so we have a lot of fun defenses of Christianity and orthodoxy. That's why we read that book. And then we read the St. Francis book, Chesterton's great exposition on this mystical saint from the middle of Christianity, about 1100, halfway between us and Christ. And Chesterton's insight into Francis's great wonder and joy and thanksgiving that compels an entirely new religious order to form. And Chester gives us a fresh look at this saint that we always associate as just being, out there with animals hanging off him all the time. And then, for a total contrast, we read St. Thomas Aquinas. And Chesterton gives us an insight into the great scholastic thinker who really brought faith and reason together by essentially baptizing Aristotle. So we show, just even in those three texts, we show how integrated our curriculum is, because we're talking about art, and we're talking about literature, we're talking about philosophy, we're talking about science, and we're talking about social development and history. So all of those different subjects that we study at Chesterton all come together in those books, and they all reach their great sine qua non, their summit, their pinnacle, their peak, when you get to your senior year and you'll be reading The Everlasting Man. And that's where he puts it all together. But since none of you are seniors yet, I'm not going to give any of it away. I'm not going to give that away. But maybe I'll come back someday and we'll talk about The Everlasting Man. Chesterton says the whole thing about a mystery story is that we can never give away the ending. The people who give away the end of mystery stories, they belong on the lowest level of hell, next to Judas and all the other traitors. Okay, if you give away the solution to a mystery, you take away a pleasure that can never be given back. So I'm not going to tell the big reveal. All right, but so that's why you read Chesterton at Chesterton Academy. It is one of the things that makes our curriculum unique, because we do study the classics, but we also use as sort of the glue that holds it all together G.K. Chesterton himself. And then we throw in a couple of his great poems, Ballad of the White Horse and Lepanto, and show you what poetry is supposed to do, with pounding rhythm and glorious rhyme, and poetry that tells a story as well as sticks in your head because of the marvelous language. Now, people have asked me, why did we start the first Chesterton Academy? How did that come about? And maybe that's one of the questions that's in your mind. So I'm going to actually answer that one before you get a chance to ask me. The reason that we started the first Chesterton Academy here in Minneapolis is because I was looking for a high school to send my own children to. And we just couldn't find the one that we were looking for. And so we started our own high school. That's how it started. We never would have dreamed or imagined that what we did would lead to all these other schools around the country and around the world, and even on other planets, for instance, in Canada. And and we just came up with a school that people could start themselves with. We created the curriculum and the templates on how to run a school. But it was really the very integrated curriculum we put together, and the fact that it could be started by other people. That's what the great appeal was, and it is astounding to see the interest and all the connections now as people from different Chesterton academies over a great geographical distance are connecting with each other. So we are making this mark on the world, and it's the work that you're doing just in front of your computer screen that is going to help start transforming the culture. It's a grassroots, ground up revolution that is changing the way people think. And when education has gone very, very poor, we're rediscovering the great truths of the past. Chesterton says we can only pass on what we've been given ourselves. That's what education is. It's truth in the state of transmission. And he points out that the education and the culture that we're passing on, it shouldn't be coming from Harvard or some modern university. And Chester said it shouldn't come from Oxford or Cambridge, the great universities of England. He says it's coming from Athens and Rome. The culture that we're passing on in a classical education is coming from Athens and Rome. In other words, it's the great Greek philosophy and Greek classical literature that we start with, and then it's passed on to Rome, especially when the church established itself in Rome. It's both classical and Christian. And he says Rome doesn't only represent the citizen, it represents the priest. It's the Catholic Church. And that's what's unique about our curriculum. It's very Catholic and very classical. And so doing that is what has led to all the pain that you're going through right now, sitting here listening to me. All right. So with that, I would love to take your questions. All right. So please tell me what's on your mind and what you particularly want to know more about G.K. Chesterton or anything else.
Let's give them a moment to put their questions in. I just have a question, I guess. So you just released a new book on the family. So kind of what was some of your favorite things about putting that book together about G.K. Chesterton's writings on the family?
So I put together, the book is pure Chesterton. I've just collected his material from vast amount of sources. He's such an incredibly prolific writer. And there's things in this book that people have not seen or haven't been printed for over 100 years. But I split it up into 6 sections, and we basically take the main concepts of the family and then contrast them with the misunderstanding or the attack on those things. So we start with just simply the family versus the world. Chesterton's great point is that the family is the basic unit of society. It's the fundamental fact of civilization. And without the family, if the family breaks apart, so does the culture, and the society breaks apart. And then we do marriage versus what attacks marriage, divorce, the breakup of the family through that. So the importance of that unity of marriage. And then the love that unites a man and a woman, well, the misuse of that is sex outside of marriage. So we deal with that. And then what's the result of that love? It's birth, it's babies. And we talk about birth versus abortion and birth control. And then the last 2 chapters are very specific to what we're doing here. It's the home versus public education, how public educational institutions have done so much to undermine the passing of truth from one generation to the next. And the family is not only responsible for education, but they need to have control of it. Even if a child is sent to a school that's outside the home, this parent still needs to be in control of education. And so that school should be responsible to the parents. And finally, and this is very important, home versus work. That the home should be the center of the life, and work and the marketplace and all those daily distractions have to have a secondary place to the home. And so an economic system that is based on the family as opposed to one that's based on the individual and individual interests. So it's all pure Chester, a lot of good stuff. And it's really good because it's just me getting out of the way and letting Chesterton talk.
Thank you for that. I did order it the other day, so I'm waiting for it to come. I'm excited.
How long do spaceships take to get to Canada?
Well, it's, if you get stuck at the border, we have to pay duty. Like, there's a bit of a process, but it's getting a little bit better. So from Mary Claire, she asked, what do you think about Chesterton's cause for beatification? And do you think it's possible?
I think it's entirely possible, and we are moving forward with that. Some of you may have heard, we were in contact with the former Bishop of Northampton, England, who's the normal person who would open the cause. And he declined to open it mostly because he didn't know much about Chesterton himself. The prophet is without honor in his own country. Even though I worked hard to educate him about Chesterton, I think he felt uncomfortable just by not being well-versed in Chesterton, although he did have a priest from his diocese conduct an investigative report. And the priest wrote a wonderful 120-page report laying the case for why Chesterton should be considered for beatification. But he was also about to retire, this bishop, and he was very gracious with me, and he said he didn't want to be the one to get in the way and prevent the cause from being open. He just wasn't going to be the one who'd open it himself. And so we're laying the groundwork to either get his successor to open the cause or another bishop. And there are several bishops who are interested in opening the cause, but the process, a bishop has to open the cause, then a postulator is appointed, a thorough investigation is made of the candidate's life, and the time that the cause is open, the candidate is considered a servant of God. The postulator will make the case to the Congregation for Saints in Rome. When they review the case, they say, yes, there's a reason that this person should be beatified, and they would declare him venerable. And then the next step is the vote from heaven, we say, and that's the miracle. And one miracle for beatification and two miracles for canonization. And that means a miracle that takes place now, showing that the saint has intercessory powers, that he's interceding for us in our prayers. And I could just tell you, we have thousands and thousands of prayer cards that we've handed out, and there's a following all over the world of people praying for Chester's intercession. And we have seen some great results of answers to prayers.
Yes, praying is very important. Okay, so it's a question that kind of came in the back room here with me. What do you think is a redeeming quality of this generation? And I mean our students, not Dr. McClarney and I. Just this generation. What do you think is a redeeming quality of this generation?
That's a lovely question, and thank you for asking it, whoever asked that. I have to say that it has to be hope, because as Chesterton says, hope means hoping when things are hopeless, or it's no virtue at all. And I think most younger generations represent hope, but I think that is the redeeming virtue of this generation, because things are really dark and bleak right now. And yet there's joy, there's people who are trying to keep moving through this. nobody's giving up here, right? Yeah, we're affected by depression and darkness and that has come out in a lot of ways. But no, this generation has not given up at all. And they're the post-abortion generation, and they do represent hope in a big way.
Oh, I love that answer. Thank you. And I totally agree. So John Moore asks, what does it mean when Chesterton says a thing worth doing is worth doing poorly?
Yeah, it's worth doing badly is the actual quote, and that's a fun one. People always like to quote that as an excuse for not doing things well, because he's playing off a famous saying, which a thing worth doing is worth doing well, and that's what we're used to hearing. Of course, Chesteron does the twist, but what he's specifically talking about there is amateurism. An amateur does something out of love. That's what the word amateur means, one who loves. And the amateur does a thing not because they're the best person who can do it, not because they're a professional who's getting paid for doing it, but because they love doing it. And it's still worth doing, even if they're not the very best person in the world who does it. So it's still worth doing, even if it's done as badly as an amateur is doing it. And what he's specifically talking about in that passage, which comes from What's Wrong with the World, is he's talking about the greatest of all amateurs, the mother. The mother does things out of love. Maybe a professional can do it with greater skill, but no, it's going to be worth doing because the mother's doing it out of love.
Great. All right. This is always a tough question. What is your favorite work of Chesterton?
Did you hear that, what they just asked? I can't say it right in front of him there. That's terrible. Now, I will say that I'll say what my favorite genre is, if that helps, because I'm not going to tell you any favorite book, but maybe I would some other time. But I enjoy reading his essays even more than his books. I love just sitting down with a 900 or 1,200 word essay. It's like a dose of medicine or a tonic. And I certainly enjoy reading a good Chesterton book or a novel or a play or a poem. But his essays are what I enjoy reading the most.
I think that was actually Cardinal Collins' answer to it last month as well. So isn't that interesting? All right. Mr. Campbell asks, in course of your studies, what insights regarding vocational discernment, particularly in respect to marriage, have you found? And then so the follow-up question is, what would you advise, what do you think Chesterton would advise to a youth on finding a path in the world? And maybe that's regards to vocation.
Yeah, lovely. Thank you for asking that one too. Chesterton, when he writes about the lay person and the priest, or the one who has the religious vocation, he really brings out a very interesting insight that I don't think a lot of people have noticed. When he talks about Jesus on the famous Beatitudes, the Sermon on the Mount, and he says, "You are the salt of the earth." Chester points out that at that moment when he says, "You are the salt of the earth," Jesus is not talking to the multitudes there. He's talking to his disciples, to the apostles, and he's telling them they're the salt of the earth. In other words, it's the priests, he's saying, are the salt of the earth. And the thing about salt, he says, is you can't live on it, but you can't live without it. So salt is not food. It is what we need to make the food interesting. It preserves the food. It makes it tasty. It makes it actually much more worth eating. And the role of the priest is salt, and it's the rest of us, the lay people, who are the meat, as it were. We're the food, and we are much more the majority. We need salt, but we can't live on salt. That is but we can't live without it. That is the fact that points out that this calling to the priesthood is something special and something that's not for everybody. And he makes the same point in the St. Francis book, that not everybody in the world can be a Franciscan friar, but you can, as lay people, we can certainly live according to Franciscan values. But the majority of the people have to take on the regular vocations, as it were. You know, the carpenters and the farmers and the electricians, the housewives, all the things that make up the world. And most of us are called to that. That's the point. Most of us are called to that non-priestly or non-religious vocation. But those of us who are called to it, we really have a great obligation to obey that calling. And it's because really, without the sacraments, we absolutely will flounder. And remember, Chesterton does, for me, represents one of the most important lay people of the 20th century, and why we need more lay saints, so for us lay people to follow. But Chesterton would never have become a Catholic had it not been for knowing a priest named Father John O'Connor, who really was the one who brought him to the Catholic Church and is the inspiration for the Father Brown character too. I don't know if I answered the question, but the point is most of us are not called to the priesthood, but those of us who are, that is a sacred calling indeed.
Ultimately, sacred calling should be called to marriage as well.
Amen. Amen. Well, I mean, but I have to say the majority of us are called to marriage. The great majority of us are called to marriage, and let's remember that's the norm. The religious life is something extraordinary and it's different, but the norm is marriage.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so a couple things. Mason asked, what's a good book or to start with? So if you were, although some of our students already have read some Chesterton, obviously this year, but if they were to kind of go into more reading, what do you think would be a good place to start, or recommend to somebody to start with if they were starting to read about G.K. Chesterton?
Well, we used to have our ninth graders start with orthodoxy, and it was my own faculty that finally shouted me down on that and said, Dale, you've written these introductory books to Chesterton. Why don't we read one of your introductory books and then read orthodoxy? And I had to admit that the reason I wrote those introductory books is to be introductions to Chesterton. And why don't we start using that for ninth grade? So that's why in ninth grade, we now assign Common Sense 101. That's a very good introductory book with Chesterton. Now, apart from the books that you're going to be reading here at Chesterton, because I consider the four texts that we assign, Orthodoxy, St. Francis, St. Thomas, and the Everlasting Man, to be kind of four essential books that you should read. But other good introductory books, read the Father Brown stories, read his book, What's Wrong with the World, or one of his collections of essays, such as Tremendous Trifles or All Things Considered. And if you like Charles Dickens, or even if you don't like Charles Dickens, his book on Charles Dickens is one of his very best books.
I think that goes into Mary Claire's comment here of any tips or tricks to understanding Chesterton. I'd love to read him more, but find his writings often been hard for me to grasp. And I think my comment to that is I can agree at that time. And it's sometimes you have to absorb it at a different rate than you would normally read a novel per se. Yeah. That would be, anyways, any other comments to that?
My introductory books are really help designed to get you to understand how Chesterton writes, how he thinks, how he uses the paradox, and so they are good guides to use for reading Chesterton. The other book I've written is another introductory book called The Apostle of Common Sense, and then I've got another one called Night of the Holy Ghost.
Okay, good. So Mr. Ignatius Birdstall asks, so are you going along with your favorite books? What's your favorite non-Chesterton book?
My favorite non-Chesterton book. What a riot. Boy, that one changes a lot. after I read The Brothers Karamazov, I would have said that was my favorite Don Chesterton book. But now I've reread Dante, the Divine Comedy, reread the whole thing, and I just can't imagine a better book than that one. So I guess it depends upon which book I've read most recently. But I mean, it's been 30 years since I read Dostoevsky, and I still have that one way up there. But yeah, it's hard to top Dante's Divine Comedy.
I think Dr. McLaurin would agree with you, but he probably has a couple other favorites too he can share. So I have probably one more question I'll just back up to, and it was about your discussion about saints. Chester becoming a saint. Has there been any miracles attested to him at this point that you're aware of?
Yeah, the answer is yes, but I can't say what any of them are.
I figured that was the response and why you left it out of your conversation. All right, Mr. Centric says, you said that giving away the end to a mystery story is very disappointing, yet it's a fundamental aspect of any story containing a twist to properly foreshadow, and for some, especially consumers, giving away the twist before it happens. Okay, I'm kind of not... Obviously, everyone will see the twist coming, and that's the point. Do you think Chesterton would have been more in favor of the traditional and generally considered to be better, properly foreshadowed plot twist, or a complete surprise? I hope I did that okay, Dean.
Yeah. Well, I think what Chesterton does with his great mystery stories is he foreshadows them only in the sense that the solution is sitting there right in front of you the whole time. You've been staring at it, Jack. And then when it's revealed, you go, oh, of course. Oh, yeah, I knew that. Except I didn't know that. I didn't ever see it. So it's really funny. The total twist that you don't see coming at all, there should have been something there. And he says, the weakness of the Sherlock Holmes stories, he said, is that Sherlock Holmes knows stuff that none of us know. And, we love watching his great genius work and his eccentricities and everything. And that's why we enjoy those stories. But really, they're totally unfair to the reader. The reader has no ability to figure this stuff out because there's no clues at all that we can recognize, because Sherlock Holmes happens to know that from the guy's strange baggy pants that he's been living out of the country for 30 years. I don't it's only when Sherlock Holmes points it out, that's when we see it for the first time, because we had no other clue in it. But a good Father Brown story and a good underdog mystery story, which is what Chesteron is the real master of, is that we all were looking at the same clues, and only the detective figured it out because he saw the one that we just didn't notice, but it was right there. We knew it. So the great reveal is to see something that you've been looking at for a long time.
Thank you. All right. I have another question here. I'd like to hear your opinion on Chesterton's greatest predecessor, St. John Henry Newman, and the influence he exerted on Chesterton and modern Christianity as a whole.
Yeah, there's no question that St. John Henry Newman is the greatest English convert of the 19th century. And Chesterton is very much his counterpart for the 20th century. He's the great English convert to the Catholic faith of the 20th century. Yes, Chesterton was very familiar with Newman. He only wrote a few things about him, a couple of different essays. He wrote an introduction to a book on Newman that someone else had written. And there's a few references here and there. What you don't ever see is a long exposition on Newman to the degree that he does, for instance, on St. Francis or on St. Thomas Aquinas. And you wish you could have more of his insights and expositions on Newman, but he clearly had a familiarity with him, and that was revealed in an anecdote about Chesterton. It was a report from a speech that he gave once, and he made a reference to Newman's thinking on something, and how it was very much in keeping with current Catholic teaching, even though Newman came up with it a century earlier. And one of the people in the audience objected, said, "Oh, Newman never said that." And Chesterton laughed, and he said, "Oh, no, you won't catch me on Newman," and proceeded to quote from memory 2 entire paragraphs from one of Newman's books. So he was that familiar that he could quote large passages of Newman from memory. I think that one of Chesterton's classic arguments in defense of Christianity is very similar to Newman's, in that the only possible explanation for the person of Christ is the true one. That all the other ones are completely unsatisfying. They simply cannot be defended as well as the truth can be defended.
Thank you. There's no other questions in the chat. Dr. McClarney, I'm sure you have something. I can't believe you haven't said anything yet.
Well, I was just waiting for all the other questions to be answered. No, one quick question is, could you just speak briefly to Chesterton's take on the environment? So he's talked a little bit about the environment. We hear a lot about that today. So briefly, could you just say a few words about that?
Yeah, Chesterton says that nature is not our mother. Nature is our sister, because we both have the same father. And that is such a great insight for how we take care of the created world. We respect our sister, we enjoy our sister, but our sister has no authority over us. And so we treat the environment well because it is our fellow creature. It's the St. Francis approach to the world, that we don't love nature because it is where we come from. No, we love nature because God created each creature, and those are our fellow creatures, and we treat them with great joy and respect and amusement. But we also realize that man is given a dominion over nature, and certain things are for our benefit. And we don't serve nature. Nature does serve us. And that is the perspective that is correct. But we also have to treat it with respect. We treat the environment with respect because we love our neighbor, right? And our neighbor sometimes hasn't been born yet. So that's why you don't pollute the water. And that's why you don't scorch the earth, because you have to also take care of your neighbor that hasn't been born yet. But the point is that it's there for human enjoyment and human nurturing and human blessing. But Chesterton says there's people who seem to be they hate humans. They love nature, but they hate humans, and that's the wrong perspective.
Thank you. Oh, and there was one question. And have you been to Canada? And if you haven't, we are graciously extending an invitation to come visit us here in the Edmonton area. I think there's some direct flights from where you are to Edmonton.
Well, you have to go into outer space before.
Yeah,
yeah. But yeah, I actually have been to Edmonton, and I've been to Calgary, and I've been to Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan. Okay.
Oh, okay.
And I've also,
that's very random, but okay.
Yeah, and then I've also been over to what's that big city on the other side? Toronto. That's where I first met Father Cardinal Collins. Was there. Yes. And I've been to Ottawa. I've spoken in Ottawa as well.
Okay, so yeah, it's not that hard to get to. It's
not hard to get to. It's just that they're always so suspicious of me when I come into Canada. What are you here for? So I'm going to talk on Chester, and they take me to the next room and they interrogate me.
Probably like who?
Full body cavity search every time I come.
Okay, so I have a question here from Veronica. What is Chesterton's view on the rational animal? Is it any different from Thomas Aquinas?
Oh, it's completely Thomas Aquinas, and of course Thomas Aquinas is Aristotle, but it's baptized Aristotle. So Chesterton is always using an Aristotelian understanding in anything he writes about, but it's you get Chesterton's voice instead of Aristotle's, and instead of Thomas Aquinas.
I think we've gotten through most of our questions, Dr. McClarney. So,
well, excellent. Well, I just once again, if we could just thank Dr. Dale Ahlquist for his graciously visiting us today and for his talk. So, thank you very much.